Hello and welcome to Biz Talk. I'm Lily Lu in Beijing. The United Nations climate talks, also dubbed as COP27, is being held in Egypt. Since COP26 in Glasgow last year, global emissions have reached record levels. And this year alone, we've seen dozens of catastrophic disasters ranging from drought in Horn of Africa to floods in Pakistan, South Africa and Australia, and wildfires and heat waves in Europe, the US, Mongolia and South America. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said, on every climate front, the only solution is decisive action in solidarity. And COP is the single biggest platform for countries to work out on how to together tackle a threat that is impacting all of the humanity. And today we have invited guests to join us and share their perspectives on climate issues and expectations on the Sharm el-Sheikh meetings. Let's welcome our guests. In the studio with me is Mr. Zhou Dadi, member of the National Expert Committee of China for Climate Change. Welcome to the studio, Mr. Zhou. Thank you so much. And also joining us online, let's welcome him, is Mr. Wei Qifan, Deputy Country Director and Climate and Energy Program Acting Director of World Resources Institute in China. Thank you so much for joining us, gentlemen, in this show. So let's start with the first question. COP27 is being held and discussions are being held right now. So tell us, what do you expect will be the highlights from the COP27 this year? Why are these issues being highlighted? Why don't we start with Mr. Zhou?
I think the most important is how to help the country to do more.
How to help countries to do more? You think that would be like the most important issue to be discussed?
Yes, to do more and not to talk more.
Okay, that is action means a lot more than words.
Yes,
okay.
Not to say, okay, you need to commit more, and we don't care how to do, how can you really realize that?
That's a good point. We're going to actually get to more on that topic later on in the show. But let me now get to Mr. Fan. What do you think are the highlights from COP27?
I think first it's about the ambition. So apparently, if we look at the emissions gap report that was just released a couple of days ago, so even if all the countries have implemented their NDCs fully, so we are still heading towards 2.8 degrees Celsius of temperature rise. So apparently, the current commitments from countries, companies, cities are still not sufficient to help us to move towards 1.5 degrees Celsius. But more importantly, I think we should look at implementation. I think that I agree very much with what Mr. Zhou mentioned just now. Implementation is important. So if we look at the implementation, so I think there are two areas that we should pay attention to. One is after we met the commitment, how can this be implemented according to our schedule, and how can we ratchet up our implementation over the years? So we have seen a lot of commitments in the last COP, at COP26, so including the NDCs, including more than 80 parties have committed to net zero, companies, cities are committed to net zero as well. So do they have the accountability or monitoring and evaluation system to see that they are making progress? So there's one part of implementation. I think the other part of implementation, I will put it this way, is that it's about how can we deal with the changing climate, because climate change is already happening. So no matter how we cut our emissions, so it's already happening. How can we increase our adaptive capacity? How can we make our development more resilient? I think that is extremely important. And at the same time, whatever we do on adaptation, the damages are already happening and will be happening. So how can we deal with this? So what in the climate term is loss and damages? How can we compensate those suffering from the changing climate? So I'll stop here. These are the three buckets of work that I think we should pay attention to. Thanks.
Yes, Mr. Fonu, you mentioned several great points that we're going to actually allow you guys to tell us more details about later on in the show. For now, we have to talk about, let's say, it is probably the elephant in the room, because it's geopolitical tensions going on, an energy crisis that is swept across the globe right now. So how much do you think that leaders at the summit might be distracted by all that?
As a the people says that the climate change issues becomes more complicated because we have so much other conflicts happened right now. Food shortage and some geopolitical conflicts in Europe and the energy crisis. Yeah. So people should pay more attention on how to solve their energy supply right now. But it doesn't mean that we should do less on climate change mitigation, because climate change mitigation measures in most of the cases can help the people to solve these kinds of challenge in a better way. So in my understanding, the people should pay more attention on how to cooperate on climate change issues, but not to say, okay, other things is more important. Let's, forget that for a while.
That's a good point you made, actually. I want to get Mr. Fang's take on that, because Mr. Zhou made a great point that the current energy crisis possibly would actually accelerate the process of our fight against climate change. Mr. Fang, do you agree, and what is your take on that?
Yeah, so I agree very much with that observation. So I think that the energy crisis that we are experiencing right now really an important reminder to us that we need to have energy security. And one way to increase our energy security is to diversify our energy resources. And renewable energy would play a very, very important role in this respect. So I think that really gives a very important signal to everyone that we should invest more in renewable energy. But on the other hand, so I think we also think that some countries are also maybe moving back to fossil fuel. So I hope that would be temporary. So I hope that we will not be a long-term lock-in to fossil fuel. So I think that is really important for us to consider. I think the third thing I would like to highlight is that whenever we move towards whether low carbon energy or low carbon development, we should think about what is the economic benefit of doing so. So we should always build that into our strategy so that we're not really just working on low carbon for the sake of low carbon, but really for the sake of sustainability, development, and green development.
Well, that's a great point that you just made here, because you talked about how this energy crunch has actually forced some countries to take a step or maybe half a step back, as we've seen some countries, including some European countries, are regrettable to know that they're switching back to coal-fired power plants just to get their citizens through this winter, to get enough energy and heat for the winter time. But eventually, as Mr. Zhou said, because we are going through an energy crisis, that should be propelling people to think more about how should we deal with climate change, because this issue, it seems like it is becoming more propelling right now. Mr. Zhou, how would you describe the current state of climate change in 2022 or maybe through next year?
Our target is to keep the warming under 2 degrees, or even to try to get that under 1.5 degree. But now it's already 1.1 degree. The warm already happened, and so you find a lot of things like the flooding in somewhere, the very drought in some other part, and the heat wave. This happened in China as well. So this year, we have very long time, more than 40 days, and somewhere is 2 months, about very high temperature happened in the Yangtze River area, and with a lot of drought. So the people need a lot of electricity for cooling and air conditioning. At that time, almost more than one third of the electricity are used for this purpose.
Mr. Zhou actually talked about this 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature control, which was a ambition set by COP26. He also mentioned how far are we actually off track. So, Mr. Fang, how far is the world off track to its targets?
So this is a very good point. So what mentioned in the Paris Agreement is below or well below 2 degree, and we try to achieve 1.5 degree. But what we have seen, so as Mr. Zhou said, that at the current warming level of 1.1, so we have seen all the extreme climates everywhere. So that really gave an important warning to us that we should try our best to achieve 1.5 degree. But so as what I said earlier on, so based on the current commitments from all the countries, so which is known as NDCs, so if everything is implemented, so just for your information, not everything in the NDCs are or can be easily implemented because some of them are unconditional, but some of them are conditional. So even if all the conditional, unconditional commitments are met according to schedule, we are still heading to 2.8 degree. Mm-hmm. So that is very, very risky. Mm-hmm. So we do need to increase our ambition so that we are more aligned with the 1.5 degree Celsius.
2.8 degrees Celsius, that sounds quite scary actually. What more can be done for countries to actually work in solidarity? Solidarity might be the biggest problem or the biggest question mark right now. How can countries actually work out actually their differences and start to work as one?
Yeah, this is a very good question. So 1.5 degree target, so that is a very huge target and it's unprecedented. So everyone should work together. So you mentioned about countries. So I think there are a couple of things that we should think about. So one is what we can do domestically within our own country to do our best to cut our emission towards the 1.5 trajectory. Number two is how can all the countries work together to share experience, to help with the capacity building, finance, and so on, so that we can join hands to achieve. So these are just countries. So on the other hand, I think we can think about who else can play a role. So I think like companies we should think about. So like now there are more than 1,400 companies already joined the science-based targets, so which are really important to help the economy to transform to a low carbon pathway. And cities, there are more than 1,000 cities have joined what we call Race to Zero to commit to achieving net zero in the 2040s. So I mean, in short, actually everyone should work together towards the 1.5 degree goal.
Okay, that actually leads to my next question. A point that Ms. Zhou made in the very beginning of our show. You talked about that this meeting is more about taking actions rather than setting out more targets. So a lot of commitments were made at COP26 actually concerning businesses, countries, cities even, and international climate initiatives. What progress has been made? I mean, it's only been a year, but have we seen any concrete progress on that? And my second question is, how can we actually make sure of the implementation of these climate policies?
I think the question is, it's a very long time program to really change the energy system from the fossil-based into the renewable-based. You cannot think that every year there should be a big change. Especially at the beginning, the change will not be very significant. But because the technology is not really ready, we need to do a lot of things to prepare. And different countries have different characteristics, especially for the developing country. In many countries, they have not enough energy supply. So they have to solve how can supply their enough electricity, fuel for the transportation, and heating or air conditioning, everything. So in this case, my understanding is we need to provide enough alternatives, enough measures for them, technology, financial support, and governance as well. But it's not easy. Although people here can understand the climate change more because we work on that so many years, but most of the people, they have cannot really handle the so complicated climate change scientific issues. So for them, it's a daily life, how to sustain that. And if you want to change, it should not be change their living
Starting
standards.
by maybe smaller things.
Yeah,
day.
so if we want to let every country say, oh, what you do this year, or what's the change, if it's enough, it's very difficult. I don't think it's a good way. So in this case, I think the developed country should, if they want to push more, they have to show what they already implemented. If they do more than their commitment. And what's the good example? And what's the pilots projects they can show and help others to follow that. That's a good way. So I think we put the 2030 or even longer, for example, 2050, 2040 as a target. I think the people will be some patient that the change will happen, but not as a linear style. It should be some time to prepare, some time to speed up, and finally to really fulfill the targets. So you cannot say, okay, every year you have to decrease 5% or 10%. Economically, it's not these issues. Economically, you need a lot of investment. Investment will happen for a couple of years after. And if system is very big, any system is big enough. If you want to change that, at the beginning, a change will be very small. For example, renewable energy. Although the increase rate is already 20%, 30%, but compared to the whole energy supply system, it still is a small proportion because at the beginning it's too small. So economically, you cannot say, okay, you increase 100 times within 1 year. It's very difficult. 20%, 30% is a very big achievement, but it's still small. So in this case, I think the most important is how to share with others your real achievement and what's the technology, what's the money come from, and how the efforts be integrated, and how the social be initiated. So these kinds of things we should talk more. And another issue is for the developing countries, they not only need the technology, they need the financial support as well. As you mentioned that developed country promised to give $100 billion per year to support the green development, to adapt or mitigate the climate change. But they have difficulties to fulfill that.
That actually didn't
so
really
that,
go
that's
through.
I think is if you want to really check or to review the commitment, I think we should to do something more consolidate.
Yeah, I agree. Mr. Fong, since we are on this topic, Mr. Zhou, since he mentioned the promise that was made in 2009 by developed nations that they will be made good on their commitment to provide about $100 billion every year in funds for developing states to combat climate change issues. That didn't really go through. Why did it fall short of their commitment?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of reasons. So I'm not an expert on finance, but based on my understanding, so this is a very complicated issue. I think firstly, what can be considered as climate finance? So how, because this can be mixed up with the ODA, can be mixed up with some other finance. So that's one thing. And second thing is that I think countries are also facing, constraint in terms of allocating such finance for developing countries. But I think very importantly for COP, this type of events, so to build trust, developed countries definitely should realize their commitment or pledges to fulfill this 100 billion finance for developing countries. So just to make it clear, it is a commitment of 100 billion per year from 2020 to 2025. So in total, so it is 600 billion. So, but based on the latest data that we have for 2020, it was only 83 billion. So it is about 17 billion short of the commitment. So it's very important to the developed countries to show their commitment by delivering this 600 billion in this coming years, and also to come up with a mechanism for post 2025 financing scheme.
Mr. Fong, other than financial support, what other support do you think developing nations need?
Yeah, I think there are lots. Financing definitely is one of them. So I think other things like technology, capacity. So a lot of things. So as I mentioned earlier, so this net zero transition is something unprecedented. So no one has any experience. So in this case, so besides finance, technology, and the broader capacity, so the other thing we should think about is how can the market play a role. So for example, in the case of renewable energy, so China has been playing a very important role by scaling up the renewable energy development over the past decade, and to reduce the cost of renewable energy. So this is really important to not only the developing countries, but also across the globe, to make renewable energy possible to achieve whether we are talking about 1.5 or 2-degree goals.
So gentlemen, do you agree that developing nations would be the leading actors at COP27?
Yes, so developing nations are very important for the success of COP, or for the success of for all of us to achieve the climate goal. So I think there are two areas that we should think about. So one is that there are many developing countries, and many of them are developing at a very, very fast pace. So if all these developing countries are moving to the high carbon development pathways, then it would be impossible for the entire world to achieve the 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius goal. So there's one thing. On the other hand, so I think another thing we should pay attention to is the impact of climate change. So there's the thing about climate change is that, so if we emit carbon dioxide, so the impact will be evenly distributed. How should I frame it? So no matter where you're located, as long as you're emitting carbon, so you're contributing to the climate change. But those are feeling the changing climate not even. So a lot of climate impacts are happening around the world, including the developing countries. But the issue is that the developing countries may not have the capacity, whether technically, financially, to deal with the changing climate. So that's why it's so important to consider the developing nations in our conversations about climate change. So both from mitigation as well as the adaptation perspective.
Mm-hmm. And also,
I think that I hope the developing country can have more voice for their interests. and their willingness. But of course, I think the developed countries will play important role as well.
Yeah.
So it's not say, okay, who will lead the others, but if you want to give some leading impacts, you do more. If you do more, you take the lead.
Yes.
If you say it more and not take the lead.
And again, we go back to the very first point that you made, that action is more important than words being made. And we know that Egypt, well, as you said, Mr. Zhou, this is the first time that a COP meeting is being held in a developing country, when Egypt is a middle-income developing country. So do you think, Mr. Fong, do you agree that we can expect Egypt to play, let's say, allow a stronger platform for developing countries to tell their demands, to share their, to actually raise their requests or demands, or maybe just share their voices?
Yes, absolutely. So this is a very special COP. So some people call it the African COP. So why it's important? Because we look at the stage of the development in Africa. So exactly as what I said just now. So this is a developing country COP. So, and if we look at Africa, so what we were facing is really development. And also we need to consider about the impact of climate change to this continent. So that's why I think besides talking about net zero in this coming COP, one of the most important thing is about adaptation and about loss and damages. So how can the developed nation help this continent to deal with the changing climate? So if we go back to the finance question, so in 2019, so the total amount of finance for adaptation was only about 20 billion. So that is about a third of the overall finance. So what we need to do, or what the developed nation has committed to, is to double the finance for adaptation by 2024. So that is about 40 billion US dollars. So that's why in this COP, we would be very much looking forward how developed nation could fulfill their commitment to increase their finance and support for climate adaptation, as well as loss and damage.
And in the meantime, Mr. Fong, what do you think is the significance of South-South cooperation in the fight against climate change?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think not only South-South collaboration, but also South-North or South-North-South collaboration. So I think we have discussed this. So there's no one single country could deal with this huge challenge, so that no one has ever experienced before. So we all need to work together, whether South-South or North-South or South-North-South. And for the case of China, so I think there is one very good and unique platform that we should leverage is the Belt and Road Initiative. How China could play a role in supporting other developing countries to deal with their development issues, as well as their low carbon development and these climate issues.
Yeah, and also that actually leads to our next question to Mr. Zhou. What role do you think China is playing globally in supporting this global fight against climate change?
China is trying to do the best based on the Chinese capacity to change, transform the Chinese own energy system from the fossil-based system into a zero carbon system. But at the same time, China is trying to do our best to really get the technology be available. For example, 20 years before, China started to develop the so-called photovoltaic power generation. But at that time, it's very expensive. At that time, 1 kilowatt hours generated from the PV costs 10 times higher than the fossil fuel generated power. So although it's a good thing, but it's not,
financially efficient.
yeah, financially reliable.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but now, based on the scaling up and the quick development of the manufacturing and the technology improvement, the PV panel, now China produce more than 90% of the total output from the world, and make it to be competitive to produce the power compared with the fossil fuel, even cheaper. So this means that if you want to really change the system, you need to give the measures that give the economically usable technology and the products. So I think in this way, China not only do our best to change our system as quickly as possible, but will help other countries to share the technology and the products.
So, Mr. Zhou, you gave some great examples on the efforts that China has been making as a major economic power in the world, trying to change its own energy mixture, and including developing new energy and also developing new energy vehicles as well. China has also done a lot more, let's say, in environmental conservation, in protecting biodiversity. So, Mr. Fang, let me get to you. As a major economic power in the world, all the efforts that China has been doing in its fight against climate change, what sort of inspiration do you think China can bring to the rest of the world?
Yeah, so there are a lot of things. So I think one thing is to prove that if we are determined to change, we would be able to make it. So just looking at the achievements that China has made over the past decade or so. For example, in terms of carbon intensity, so there is a significant reduction of carbon intensity in China over the past 2 decades. And look at the deployment of renewable energy. So currently, it's about 16.6% of installed or the primary energy consumption in China is renewable energy. So all this is possible if we are determined to do so. Of course, China has its advantages. For example, the economies of scale is one thing that China has been playing a big role. Like just now I mentioned about how China brought down the cost of renewable energy, which is beneficial not only to China, but beyond. So I think that is one thing. And the second thing is how China will work together with other developing as well as developed countries to share the experience and to join hands to identify or to develop the policy and technology innovations to deal with the net zero goals that all of us have.
All right. So China has set up its own dual carbon goals. In carbon neutrality goals, both by peak by 2030 and then zero by 2060. So, do you think that China is on the right track to meet those targets? And what sort of opportunities and challenges do you think that those goals bring?
Yeah, so this is a very good question. So if we look at the data, so far, China has already achieved 50.8% of a carbon intensity reduction from 2005 level. So, and the commitment is to achieve 65% by 2030. So apparently we are on track to achieve that. So as well as in terms of non-fossil energy, so just like I mentioned about 16.6%. So we should be on track to achieve the 25% commitment. So all these are very important at the national level. So, and don't forget, I think there are 2 other players that we should pay attention to. So one is subnational, so the provinces and cities. So as the national government has already gradually come up with the so-called 1+N climate policy framework. So we see more and more provinces. So I think now there are more than 20 provinces already come up with their own provincial 1+N policy framework. So what we see is that the provinces are taking action in line with the directive or the policy from the national level. And if we look at cities, so since 2010, so more than 10 years already, so there are low carbon city pilots. So currently there are more than 80 of them. So I hope the government will continue with these pilots to leverage the potential of cities to lead the transition. So we also see some other pilots like low carbon pilot industrial parks, low carbon counties, and so on. So all these innovative measures that China has to achieve the 2030 and 2060 goals that we have. And the other player is companies. So globally, so there are already more than 1,400 companies join what we call science-based targets that for companies to commit to targets that align with the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. So within China, so there are already more than 100 of them join the initiative. So I think this is very important. So not only to these companies, but also their supply chain. So and the other private sector player that we should not forget is the SOEs. So based on the latest, so all the SOEs would have to complete the action plan for carbon emission peaking by end of the year. So I'm very much looking forward to see how these SOEs will play their role in this transition.
Mm-hmm. That's actually a very interesting point, Mr. Zhou. You're also an expert in how the industries can actually, integrate their operation with environment conservation and energy mixture change. What role do you think that China's maybe key SOEs can play in this process?
Yes, we are trying to do our best to peak the carbon emission before.
Mm-hmm. Ahead of schedule. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the issue is there's no problem we will achieve that target by 2030, but we can do better than we peak the carbon emission before 2030. Then how far before? Yes, we should do based on our doing. And we can find, we can, before 2030 for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, or even 5 years.
That's great.
Yeah, so, I think the Chinese situation is when we promise something, we have to very convinced that we will fulfill that. Yeah. It's not just say, okay, we say that, but we will not perhaps not do that. Mm-hmm. So in Chinese political issues, there's the country commit to all the other country and commit to the whole the people. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we stick with our commitment.
We really do that. So all the targets we committed is better complemented.
It will be delivered even maybe ahead of schedule,
better.
Even delivered in a better higher level.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So the issue is that China will try to peak before 2030. Yes, my suggestion and my understanding.
We could definitely use that optimism. Yeah. Thank you so much, Mr. Zhou. And my final question to Mr. Fong, let's talk a bit more touch upon what businesses can do in this process. Oil and gas companies have been announcing near record profits recently because of the energy crisis, and the demand for fossil fuel is on the rise. And the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called for the fossil fuel companies all over the world to make payments to those most damaged by climate crisis. How likely do you think that this actually will go through? And in what ways do you think can businesses, especially traditional oil and gas companies, play in our fight against climate change?
Yeah, thank you for this great question. So I may not want to deal just the oil and gas companies, but more broadly, I think companies would play a very important role. So not only to themselves. So that's the reason I think we should not only look at one or any particular sector or any particular type of companies, but actually we should look at a company as a series of value chains or supply chains. So actually it's connected not only to those oil and gas companies or coal companies, but also what we are consuming every day. So the end product companies. So all these are interconnected with the supply chain. So I think companies can play a really important role in decarbonizing the entire supply chain by changing their business model. So to do so, I think there are businesses. So profit, of course, is the most important thing. So it's important. So now is to how to turn all this climate action into something profitable. So that means, so we need to think about how we design our product, how we produce our product, and how we sell our product, and how we work with our suppliers to drive the change across the supply chain. So by doing so, what we are changing is not only any particular company, but it's the entire supply chain from the user product to the most upstream companies, like what you mentioned about oil and gas companies. So I think to conclude, I think all the companies should join hands to change the way they do their business, they produce their product, and they sell their product.
All right, great insights. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you very much, Mr. Zhou Dadi, and thank you very much, Mr. Fan. And we on CGTN will get you more details on the ongoing COP27 and bring you up to speed. Once again, thank you. That was our guest, Mr. Zhou Dadi, member of the National Expert Committee of China for Climate Change, and also Mr. Wei Qifan, Deputy Country Director and Climate and Energy Program Acting Director of World Resources Institute, China. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Great talk on climate issues. Thank you very much. And that's it for this edition of BizTalk. I'm Lily Lu. Till next time, bye for now.